Hello, everybody, and welcome to your online lecture for Chapter 9. I really miss my students. I miss you guys. I miss our classroom, and I'm going to miss interacting with you and seeing your reactions and hearing our discussion about the things we're going to talk about today. But this is the next best thing. We have the technology, so even in this time of social isolation, we can still get together over the internet. But I do wish we could be in person. I miss you. Drop me a line if you have any questions or concerns about how the class is going to be going forward. And with that, let's get into Chapter 9. Chapter 9 is about pop culture, which is short for popular culture. So we're going to start off by looking at some different types of culture, defining those, and then we're going to zero in on popular culture, what it is, how we create it, and how it affects our lives. So let's start by looking at a variety of culture types, beginning with folk culture. The main characteristic to remember about folk culture is that people don't do it to make money. The primary motive for participating in folk culture is not financially driven. Folk culture is how people express themselves in a particular culture. It's the organic way they express themselves through crafts or song or ceremonies. So it's motivated by creating a sense of community. It's motivated by continuing tradition, things like that. So we could say music, dance, crafts, things like that that are often traditional to a particular cultural group, and this is usually localized. So I've given you some examples here of folk culture. Native American powwows would be one. A tribe will get together periodically, have a powwow. It is imbued with song and dance and costume that is traditional. It is an expression of culture that is not being performed to make money. It's being performed to bring the community together to enact certain cultural rites and rituals. Amish quilt making. You may have heard the Amish are famous for their handmade quilts, and the quilts sometimes tell a story. The Amish believe that only God is perfect, so they will often put an imperfection in the quilt deliberately, like have a piece, a square going the wrong direction as a humbling exercise. So these quilts are not made to make all kinds of money. They're made to pass on tradition within the community and within families. Hula dancing. In Hawaii, hula dancing is a cultural ritual that is sometimes performed for tourists, but it's often also performed for its own sake as a way of celebrating local culture. And then we have local crafts. In some areas of the country, there might be certain foods or handmade items that are an expression of the culture of that area. For example, in the American Southwest, you might find a lot of turquoise and silver jewelry being made as an expression of local culture. So all those things come under the umbrella of folk culture, something that is done as an expression of the culture to bring the community together. A second type of culture we would call high culture. Okay, so think of high culture, very snooty, right? High culture, some examples are ballet, symphony, fine arts, museums, things like that. These are cultural experiences that are traditionally available to the educated and or wealthy. Some characteristics of high culture, it can be expensive. If you've ever gone to a Broadway show or even the Broadway touring shows at Miller, you know that those tickets are pretty costly. So these experiences might not be available to everyone because the cost is prohibitive. Sometimes they involve travel. Let's say you wanted to go to Paris to tour the Louvre Museum, or even you wanted to go to Chicago to tour the Chicago Institute of Arts. Those experiences involve travel, which involves transportation and hotel expense and things like that. So that puts them out of bounds for people who can't afford them. And then they also require a certain level of education or exposure to the arts that enables you to understand or appreciate them. Not everybody is going to appreciate classical music or certain kinds of art if they haven't been taught about them or raised in a culture that appreciates them. So people like you and me sometimes get to have these high culture experiences. I've had some of them, and I imagine you have too. But for us, it's an occasional treat because usually they're kind of out of our league a little bit. They're too expensive and a little too highbrow for the masses. On the other hand, there's low culture. And I don't want you to think of low culture as being something shameful or unworthy or something like that. It just means it's culture that's available to the masses, okay? So things like television, football games, magazines, novels, things like that, that just about anybody can afford to partake in and just about anybody would have access to. So some characteristics of low culture experiences: they tend to be low in cost, so they're affordable for most people. They tend to be local, so you wouldn't have to travel and incur a lot of travel expense in order to get to them. And they are easy to understand or appreciate. You don't have to have a special education in music or art or something like that to understand these kind of cultural experiences. So this is the kind of cultural experience that most of us engage in most of the time. So that leads us into our topic for today, popular culture or pop culture. And popular culture or pop culture is just another name for low culture. So the things I just talked about referring to low culture also apply to pop culture. The terms can be used interchangeably. And pop culture is systems or artifacts that most people share, most people know about. Okay, so pop culture examples would be things like highly rated television shows, the shows that everybody's watching and that you could talk about with a classmate or a coworker and they probably saw it too. Blockbuster movies, same kind of idea. A lot of people saw it and would know what you were talking about and be able to engage in conversation with you because they had that experience too. And affordable fashion. You might have heard the term fast fashion before. Stores like Forever 21 or H&M that have kind of inexpensive, trendy clothes that are not super high quality and they're going to go out of style quickly, but they are an affordable way for a lot of people to experience fashion trends just for one season. So we all take part in these kind of pop culture experiences that are commonplace and affordable and easy to access. Now, at the beginning of the lecture, I talked about folk culture and how those folk experiences were things that people didn't do to make money. Well, now we're going to the flip side. Culture industries do exist to make money. They exist to create and export pop culture with the purpose of making money. And a great example of this is Disney. Think about the Frozen franchise of Disney. The movie came out, there's plush toys, there were Halloween costumes, songs, songbooks, just everything you can imagine. And it was all created from imagination, created out of nothing, and it's being sold and perpetuated in order to make money. It's a money maker for Disney. So Disney is what we would call a culture industry. A lot of television producers are also culture industries. There are certain shows that are all over the world, and the producers are making money on all of these different franchises. One example would be Dancing with the Stars. This started in Britain as a show called Strictly Come Dancing. They're now in 42 countries, so the BBC International distributes that and makes a lot of money off the various versions of Dancing with the Stars. A couple of other ones are the Idol franchise, like American Idol. The Idol franchise also started in Britain as a show called Pop Idol, and it's all over the world as well. And then America's Next Top Model. This one originated in Germany. Heidi Klum actually founded the Top Model show. And when you look at the different versions of Top Model around the world, it's really interesting because it gives you glimpses into what those cultures consider to be feminine beauty ideals. In some of these countries, the models depicted are very skinny, just like bone thin. In others, like in Britain, the women are a little curvier, have a little more meat on their bones than the skinny representations. Interestingly, in Mexico, in the opening credits of Top Model, where they're showing each of the women, there's a number next to them. And at first I was wondering, what is that? But then I realized the numbers are like 19, 22, 18, 24, 21. I thought, oh my goodness, that's their age. So what would a critical scholar think of the fact that those women's ages are being depicted in that particular culture and maybe not in other cultures? In the, I believe it's the Chinese opening to Top Model, they show the women in cute little like school uniforms looking very innocent, and then next to that is a picture of them dancing in a bikini. So there's a juxtaposition of sweet and sexy there. In some of the Top Model versions, the women are very smiley, and others are very solemn looking. You get differences in hairstyles. Some countries depict a lot of diversity in their Top Model contestants, others do not. So as outsiders looking in, we would draw conclusions about what the culture values based on what we see. And I encourage you to go on YouTube and look at some videos of the Idol franchise and the Top Model franchise around the world. It's quite enlightening and gives you a lot of food for thought as to how money can be made by perpetuating one of these franchises and spinning it off and putting it in different countries and adapting it culturally to different settings. Let's talk about cultural texts, okay? Cultural texts are cultural messages, especially ones that come from pop culture, and these are some sort of an artifact. It's not necessarily written, but it can be. Now, when we think of a text, we think of something written, but a TV show could be a cultural text, okay? Or a series of photographs could be a cultural text. Something tangible that you can analyze and draw conclusions about a culture from would be a cultural text. So, for example, I was talking about those opening credits of the Top Model shows around the world and how they differ. Those would be a cultural text, and you could analyze it from that perspective. Another example would be when I was in graduate school, I wrote a paper on a particular season of Project Runway because there was an interesting dynamic among the contestants in that season that had to do with lying and deceiving each other. So I did an analysis of that season of Project Runway from a critical perspective, taking into account that the fact that it's an edited show and the producers were showing us what they wanted to show us, but just examining that dynamic of how the people interacted with each other. I was using that season of Project Runway as a cultural text. You could use clothes. If there was a museum exhibit of 18th century women's gowns or something, you could analyze those as a cultural text. It's just a tangible thing, a tangible representation of a culture that you could analyze, that could tell you something about the culture and what it values, what it cares about, what it puts forward. So some examples here: romance novels are cultural text, magazines, reality shows, soap operas, any of those kinds of things we would consider a cultural text, and they're a lot of fun to analyze. Magazines, as I mentioned, were a huge part of pop culture, and magazines sell advertising based on what they call reader profiles. So they're telling the prospective advertiser who their average customer is. You know, our customer is a female between 18 and 35 who works full-time and has disposable income and things like that. And so when an advertiser buys ad space in that magazine, they're buying access to that average reader. So what does the average reader look like? That's what they're concerned about. And that's why we have so many specialized magazines, because advertisers are trying to reach those very specific target markets. So if you go into, you know, Meijer or Walmart or gas station or any place like that, look at a rack of magazines, you'll see a lot of specialized magazines. I mean, there's some for general interest, you know, like People or something like that, but there are many that are just really specialized, like for people who like quilting, or for people who like hunting and fishing, for people who collect certain things, that type of thing. Looking at these magazine covers here, you can guess who the representative reader is of each of these. The Girls Life magazine on the left, the reader profile there would probably be a teenage girl. We see this girl on the cover. She's pretty, she looks young. And then you look at the blurbs on the cover: fall fashion you'll love, my first kiss, your dream hair. All the topics are about, you know, how to look pretty, how to be popular in school, things like that. So that's the person the advertiser is buying access to. On the other hand, you look at Boys Life on the right, and you see that the cover story is Explore Your Future. There are pictures of a firefighter's helmet and a police badge and an airplane and a microscope and things like that. So what this artifact tells us is that boys are interested in things that are active, and they're interested in careers and things like that. So I've seen studies done on this particular picture, this image, this pair of magazines next to each other, analyzing the topics in each one, and why would you not include the career stuff in the girls magazine and things about appearance in the boys magazine, because don't boys care about their appearance too? But again, the advertisers in these are buying access to a specific kind of reader, and the advertisers in Girls Life are buying access to a girl who cares about those things, like they're going to try to sell her shampoo and makeup and things like that. When you think back to some of your earlier communication classes, you might remember learning about a source and a receiver, an encoder and a decoder. So the source or the encoder encodes a message, sends it to the receiver who then decodes it, but you're always decoding through your perceptual set. Okay, so what was intended and what was perceived might not match up. It can change in the process. Okay, so let's look at that magazine cover for Girls Life. What is encoded in that cover? Well, what is encoded is if you're a young woman and you want to be happy, then you care about the way you look, you care about being popular, and you care about having soft and shiny hair and being a good kisser and things like that. That's the message that was encoded, but what is decoded? Well, if I'm a young woman going up to the newsstand looking at that cover, the message I might receive through my perceptual set might be, well, they're really demeaning young women to think that those are the things we care about, and that magazine is garbage. If that's my attitude, I am not decoding the same message that they encoded. Something was lost in the process. So we're always negotiating through our own perceptual set what things mean. Meaning doesn't exist in and of itself. It's created in that process. We determine what things mean. An example here, it says, what does porn mean? There's that famous saying, well, what is pornography? Well, I don't know, but I know it when I see it. So think about that. Think about the word vulgar. What is vulgar? Well, it's going to be different for everybody. Something that's perfectly normal to one person might seem vulgar to another person. So keep this in mind, that we may not decode these cultural messages in the same way that they were intended. Some examples of encoding and decoding. Think about things like children's toy commercials. You see little kids playing with a toy. The message that's encoded there is that this toy is, you got to have it because it's going to let you have fun, and you're going to have friends and fun, and you're going to laugh if you get this toy. And the subtext is, go ask mommy and daddy to buy it for you, right? That's the message that's encoded there. Does the child decode it in the same way? Sometimes, sometimes not. They're going to filter it through their own perceptual set. So maybe that toy doesn't look like fun to that particular kid. Soft drink commercials. They're usually depicted as people outdoors, running around, having fun, drinking Mountain Dew or Pepsi or Coke or what have you, having fun with friends. Again, the idea, the message is, if you buy this product, you will have this kind of life. Fast food commercials, often the same way. They often depict friends or family eating and enjoying that good food and enjoying each other. So the message that is encoded there is that partaking of this food, it's not only tasty food, but it's going to offer you a sense of warmth and companionship and belonging. Beer and alcohol commercials are interesting to analyze as a cultural text because they usually depict a group of adult friends watching a game or something and just laughing and having a great time while they're drinking their beer or whatever. So again, the message that's being encoded there is that this product will lead you to fun, camaraderie, a sense of belonging. And that's really what they're selling as much as the beer itself. Now, if we put our critical thinking hats on, we're going to put our critical scholar hats on here, we realize that not every advertiser goes with the standard cultural message. Some of them go against it, or they preempt the message. One example is the Dove Real Beauty campaign. Dove in this campaign is saying the rest of the world thinks beauty is tall, skinny, white women, but we're going to go against that and try to show beauty in a variety of of skin colors and body shapes, and we're going to try to maybe get ahead of the message and drive the message. So the Dove Campaign for Real Beauty uses models like those you see here who represent a variety of different shapes, sizes, and colors. Now, is this truly a diverse group? You could argue both sides of that. I mean, they're all reasonably attractive. While they are of different weights, none of them is really obese. You know, so there are some body types that aren't represented here. Also, skinny. The very skinny woman isn't represented here either. So they might have ways to go as far as representing all the ways of looking at beauty, but that is the idea behind this campaign. And what they're saying to the consumer through this is, the message they're trying to encode is, our products are for you, and you, and you, and you, all you women out there who don't fit the ideal and look a little different. You're tall, you're short, you have heavy thighs. We want you for our customer. You are our ideal. That's what they're trying to say. They're preempting that societal message that you have to be just one way and trying to introduce a new message that you can be yourself and be acceptable. Let's examine this idea a little further of resisting the power structures, and we'll put our critical hats on again. A lot of individuals will try to resist pop culture and not do the popular thing or go with the popular thing. And some people will fight back against cultural norms or cultural icons. One example that has been in the news a lot in recent years, Indian mascots for sports teams, Native American mascots. There's been concern about whether that is cultural appropriation, whether that is honoring or insulting particular cultures. In the area of cultural appropriation, you also have things like cornrowed hair, white women wearing hairstyles that are typically associated with black women and vice versa. Is that cultural appropriation, and is it okay? Is it okay to wear clothing or jewelry that is associated with a particular culture just because you like it and you think it looks nice, when to that culture it has very deep meaning? Is that kind of appropriation appropriate? What about Halloween costumes? Is it appropriate, say, to dress like an Indian chief for a Halloween party? The picture you see here was from a campaign a few years back called We're a Culture, Not a Costume. And it was trying to raise awareness of people wearing Halloween costumes that were actually cultural appropriation. So for example, you see a young Asian girl holding up a poster of a geisha girl, and she's saying this is not okay as a costume. This is cultural appropriation. This has meaning that you are ignoring if you just dress like this for fun. And there were a number of pictures like this in that series that were Culture Not a Costume, of people of different ethnicities holding up a picture of a Halloween costume people might wear that kind of depicts their culture and saying, this isn't right, this isn't fun, this is insulting to my people. So you do get backlash and ridicule and argument and tension about that based on perceptual set. Again, is it right to use particular names for particular ethnicities or not? Things like that. Those are examples of people who might choose to resist pop culture and say, don't use that word. Or if you're going to wear that, you really should know what it means. Or if you're going to get a tattoo of that, that word in that language, you should understand the deeper meaning behind what that is and not just get it because you think it looks cool. Continuing with this idea of power and resistance, there's been a backlash against a lot of pop culture artifacts such as Disney movies and commercials. Starting with commercials, we can see race and racist issues in commercials. I think we watched the one in class of the Cheerios commercial with the mixed family, and we talked about how there was some backlash from some people who didn't like that depiction of a family. Remember, there was a white mom, a black dad, and a biracial daughter, and that commercial got a lot of pushback from people who didn't like seeing that kind of family. If you look at commercials from the 50s and 60s, and this is another thing that's fun to do, you can go online and go down a rabbit hole looking at old TV commercials. You'll find a lot of things that today we would label racist from our perceptual standpoint of the year 2020. And when they were made, when they were encoded, that might not have been the intention, but there was so much institutionalized racism in the culture at the time that maybe it wasn't even noticed. For example, there was a Jell-O commercial where they had a cartoon of a baby in a high chair that had a little pointed hat on, and they say, "Oh, a Chinese baby like Jell-O," and they were talking in this fake Asian accent. And why were they depicting a Chinese baby liking Jell-O? It was supposed to be funny, I guess, but nowadays we would look at that and we'd say, that doesn't feel right to many of us in our current culture. And then with Disney as well, it's fascinating if you look for racism in Disney and some of the older cartoons, you can find it pretty easily. One of my favorites when I was a little girl was the Aristocats, and there are some Siamese cats in there that are depicted as very very negatively with Asian stereotypes of the time. So those kind of things were quite common. Disney did not release Song of the South on video because of all the racist content. It's considered racist now. It would not have been at the time it was made, maybe, but they did not release it. They kept it in the archives. Fantasia, when they re-released it a few years ago, they cut parts out of it that were designated as racist. So we can ask ourselves the question, do these just reflect the times? Are they just a cultural artifact of the times and should be left alone? And should they be studied from a critical perspective and commented on? Or should we change them after the fact? Should we say we don't want people seeing that anymore? We don't want kids watching that nowadays, so we're going to edit that stuff out. And you could argue both sides of that. Do we leave it alone as a cultural artifact and use it to educate people? Or do we, and if we do that, we're taking the risk that they might take it at face value, or do we edit it and change it to reflect the sensibilities of today? And Disney has kind of done that. They've held things back from release and they've re-edited things to meet modern sensibilities. Another depiction in Disney that's just incorrect is Pocahontas. The real Pocahontas was about 12 years old. She was not in a romantic relationship with John Smith. In the cartoon, she's depicted as an adult woman, very sexualized, and in this romantic relationship with the white settler who comes, which, okay, all kinds of problematic stuff there. She embraces and welcomes the white man who comes, It would be different if it's a 12-year-old child acting as a guide for this man versus an adult woman engaging in a romance with him against the will of her people, which is what's depicted in the cartoon. What is worrisome is that a lot of people who don't know about the real historic Pocahontas are going to look at that cartoon and take that as authentic when it's very far from authentic. So if you look at these things with a critical eye, you realize that they are problematic in these ways. So do we leave it alone? Do we change it? Do we comment on it? Do we just let it stand as it is and let everybody filter it through their own perceptual set? What do we do to resist or push back against these depictions in pop culture? Our perceptions of other cultures are highly influenced by the pop culture that we see from them. Okay, so you see pop culture of England or Germany or Korea, and you have never been to those countries and you don't know much about those cultures. That pop culture is going to be very influential on the way you think about those cultures. And it works the other way too. There are certain iconic things about American culture that people in other places of the world will think are representative of what we are like when maybe they have nothing to do with what we are like. So consider some of these things I have listed here. The show Sex and the City is very popular overseas. So is Friends. And both of those shows depict young people in a big city, in expensive apartments, with interesting, prestigious jobs, making a lot of money, and having really exciting social lives. If you do not know anything about American culture, and especially about young people who are like right out of college and what they can afford and what kind of jobs they work, you might assume that was the norm in America because we're exporting that idea, right? The show The Apprentice, which is no longer on, but if you ever saw it in the days when Donald Trump was telling people you're fired, it depicted kind of a cutthroat, profit-focused attitude toward business that might have been easy to assume was just the American way of doing business. Reality shows. I understand that Keeping Up with the Kardashians is very popular overseas, and I always say, I hope people don't think that depicts the typical American family, but that kind of show does put a certain image out into the world of what things are like, and it can be erroneous. Cecil the Lion, you may or may not remember this, it was quite some time ago, but there was a story in the news where a big game hunter had killed this lion. Okay, so it was like a trophy hunter who killed this lion, and this lion had been prowling around this village. It had lived in the outskirts of this village for its whole life, and it was named Cecil. And there was an outcry on the part of Americans and Western culture that, oh, it was so terrible that this man had killed this magnificent beast. You can look this up on the internet if you're curious. But interestingly, there were other stories juxtaposed against that of the people who lived in that village. A lot of them were glad that the lion was gone because they were afraid of it. They were afraid of letting their kids play outside and things like that, and they considered it kind of a threat to their community. And while none of them were going to kill it, and some of them thought it was wrong that it was killed, they were still kind of relieved that it was gone. So there was a flip side to that story of, oh, it's so terrible that this person did this. But the flip side was that some of the locals were glad that it happened. So remember that perceptual set and that standpoint is going to make a huge difference in the way we interpret these cultural events. I don't know if you saw the movie Inside Out. I love this movie. It showed a little girl and her parents and their emotions and how their emotions were driving them and governing the things that they did. And there's a couple of things in the movie that were changed for different markets. For example, the picture on the left, if you saw the movie, you might remember that the little girl, whose name was Riley, hated broccoli, okay? But in many parts of the world, broccoli is a very common ingredient in their foods, and kids like it. So they switched it to green peppers for releasing the movie in certain countries, because in those parts of the world, kids tend to dislike green peppers. So this kind of goes along with the translation and interpretation stuff we were talking about before. By changing it to green peppers, it's more of an interpretation. It has to be something that kids don't like. That's the point of it. So they changed it. And then the pictures on the right, you might remember if you saw the movie again that Riley played ice hockey, and you can see at the top there a hockey game going on. Well, in some parts of the world, they changed it to soccer. For a lot of the European releases, it was soccer that Riley played and was obsessed with. So, where ice hockey isn't popular and people wouldn't understand this little girl's obsession with playing ice hockey, they would understand the obsession with soccer a lot better. So it was changed for that. So again, pop culture, making it relatable to the people who are going to see the movie. Pop culture can create and reinforce stereotypes, and it can often do this by playing on our desire for inclusion. So we're given what is a stereotype of what an attractive woman should look like, what an attractive man should look like. And if we desire to be considered attractive, we're going to play into that, and it's going to reinforce the stereotype, right? So if you're told you need to wear this, you need to eat this, you need to buy this to be a fashionable, exciting person, we want to be considered exciting and fashionable. We have this desire for inclusion, so we're going to do it, and it becomes a self-perpetuating cycle. So think about this. What is American? We say, oh, hot dogs and apple pie, but what cultural artifacts are iconically American? And then who gets to decide what those are? Is it outsiders who label certain things as American, or is it us? How does it happen that certain things get tagged as being American? And I'll just let you ruminate on that. Okay, again, it comes down to perception and perceptual set. And then think about what happens to underrepresented audiences, people who are rarely, if ever, depicted in any pop cultural artifacts, people who don't see someone who looks like them on a TV show or in a book. How does that reinforce the stereotype that those people don't matter or aren't worthy of having an opinion about how our community should be run? Let's look at this idea of power and imperialism then, still wearing our critical scholar hats here. When you hear the word imperialism, think of empire. Okay, so we know that Britain and America have each had empires throughout history, right? We've had territorial rights over different countries. We've had cultural influence over a lot of different places. And so cultural imperialism is the dominance of the economically successful. So it's how American culture has permeated many parts of the world. And sometimes it's welcome, sometimes it's not. You'll see a McDonald's in every major city on the planet, right? Sometimes that's exciting to the locals, sometimes it's not. But American culture has really permeated our TV shows, our food, our fashion is pervasive almost everywhere in the world, except in countries that um, have nationalist discourse. And what that means is countries that limit how much can come in from the outside. Okay, so most countries have kind of a permeable membrane that other cultures kind of seep in and we experience those. But there are some countries like North Korea that block out any outside influences, right? There are some countries like historically China has censored the internet quite a bit. So that is a place of nationalist discourse where your loyalty is supposed to be to your own country and your own people, and you're not supposed to allow outside culture to come in. A lot of these countries have a national media. I understand that in North Korea, when you buy a TV set, it is already preset for certain channels and their government channels. So you can't get anything else. They're trying to limit exposure and kind of draw a hard boundary around the culture so that other cultures do not permeate. That's it for chapter 9. I will get to work on chapter 10 for you, or is it 11? Whatever the next one is, I'll get to work on that for you very soon. And again, I really miss you guys. Pay attention to your email and to e-learning to see what it is we're working on from week to week. And I'll talk to you again very soon. Bye.